We are in the fourth Sunday of Epiphanytide. Epiphany is a strange season, or Epiphanytide rather, is a strange season because Christmas never moves dates. Christmas is always on December 25th, but as you're likely very aware, Easter moves depending on the cycles of the moon and other factors. And so Epiphany can run from up to 8 weeks to be as short as 4 or 5 weeks, depending on the date of Easter. This year, it's 5 weeks. I guess 6, technically, if you include the Epiphany. And so we are coming to the end of this season, and Lent is quickly approaching. I know that because all the different Christian publishing houses that I subscribe to their email lists are sending me notifications. Lent is soon. Are you prepared? Have you bought your devotionals yet? We're not buying devotionals, but Ash Wednesday will be here before we know it. And I want to just give you that reminder so that you can begin preparing your heart and setting your intentions for the Lenten season. Epiphanytide is a season of glory. We are continuing to celebrate God showing God's self to us, God revealing God's self to us, and even more, God manifesting God's self to us. In the Old Testament, as Israel wandered through the wilderness, God's glory would descend on the tent of meeting. And the name in Hebrew for that glory is Shekinah. The people of Israel knew when Moses was meeting with God in the tent of meeting. And yet, that kind of revelation was not yet a manifestation. Right? When Moses, before all of the wilderness wanderings and the exodus from Egypt, when he encountered God in the burning bush in the deserts of Sinai, he could not see Christ clearly. He knew he was speaking to God, the God of his forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But he could not see Christ. His eyes were not yet opened. And that's the difference between a revelation and a manifestation. God comes to take up physical space in our world in the incarnation. He manifests himself. Which brings me to what is a very simple point, and yet is at the heart of our faith. That seeing Jesus is seeing God. In John's Gospel, Jesus talks about how anyone who has seen him has seen the Father. Seeing Jesus is seeing God. It doesn't necessarily exhaust God's person, but it is a true representation of God's nature. And when we see God in Jesus, we can rest assured, and this, I think, is the kind of rest that we seek, that God is not hiding anything from us. He's not holding anything back. He makes himself truly known in Jesus. And Jesus is God's person, right? I want to use that phrase in a really careful, but also in a really particular way. A lot of times when we come across the title Son of Man in the Gospels, as it's used for Jesus, we have become so habituated to it and so used to it that we think about it in a really particular way. We think about it as this title that Jesus has ascribed to him and takes for himself. But if you go back to where that phrase originates in the scriptures, it comes from the apocalyptic language that's used in the book of Daniel and the book of Ezekiel. And when it's used there, it's not used in a way where like we're looking forward in time with Daniel or Ezekiel and Israel and looking for a specific person. It really just means, it's kind of a generic term that just means human one, right? One like a human comes with God and is God's person, God's ambassador, God's spokesperson. And so when Jesus allows that phrase to be ascribed to him, or he uses that phrase to describe himself, especially in Mark's gospel, what he's saying to us is not that he is taking on a title, but what he's doing is he's pointing backwards and saying, when God promised to reveal God's self to Israel in those texts, in those prophecies from Daniel and Ezekiel, I am the one who is God's ambassador in those places. So you can trust that God is coming to you to speak to you because I'm the human one. I'm the person. I'm God's chosen person here to speak with you. But what we learn about this special person, this human one, God's person, through the course of following Jesus' teachings and his life, is not just that this is God's person, but that this is God in person. That this is not just a manifestation of God, but the manifestation of God. Maybe you've heard the phrase, when people tell you who they are, believe them. Have you heard that? A lot of times it's used in a negative sense. It's like people are shocked to find out that somebody is as bad as they are, right? But you kind of like look back and there's those breadcrumbs all along that they were actually like this, and then so it's kind of like a warning. When people tell you who they are, believe them. Well, Jesus tells us who he is. And he does it in the Beatitudes. Jesus opens his mouth and teaches both the disciples and the crowds. And he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the pure in heart, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake." And it's true that Jesus is talking about the people who are gathered to him, but because he's talking about the people who are gathered to him, he's talking about people who participate in his own life, people who are becoming like him. And so Jesus tells us who he is when he pronounces the Beatitudes. These are primarily descriptions of Jesus. Jesus is poor in spirit. Jesus is one who mourns. Jesus is meek. Jesus hungers and thirsts for righteousness. Jesus is merciful. Jesus is pure in heart. Jesus is a peacemaker. Jesus is persecuted for righteousness' sake. Jesus tells us who he is. This is a really crucial moment in Jesus' ministry. It takes up 3 chapters in Matthew's gospel, and it's not an accident that it takes up that much space or that it comes this early in Jesus' ministry. Jesus calls the crowds. Well, the crowds are drawn to Jesus because what's happening before this is Jesus has gone all throughout Galilee, teaching in the synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and affliction among the people. And so his fame spreads. This is just Matthew. I'm not calling anything up from mine. I'm just looking at the Bible. If you want to open a Bible, I would encourage you to do it. You can fire up your electronic Bible if that's the way you do it. And even though I do that regularly, I still would prefer a paper Bible any day of the week. I'll give you a moment. We're in Matthew 5. If you go just to the section before 5:1, starting in verse 4 or chapter 4 verse 23, Jesus he's teaching, he's proclaiming, he's healing, and so his fame spread throughout all Syria, right? That's a Gentile region. We should be really thoughtful about noting that. He's up in Galilee. Syria is near Galilee, kind of like to the northwest of Galilee. And they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases, pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics. Really important to note that having seizures and being paralyzed are differentiated from having demons here. I think that's important. Diseases and pains, like there's something else going on there. And he healed them. And you can imagine that if somebody is speaking authoritatively and confidently, and they're bringing good news, and that good news is accompanied by evidence that what he's saying is true because people are being freed from all kinds of various bodily and spiritual oppression, that it's going to draw a crowd. And so great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis. That's a Greek region that's across the Jordan River from near where Galilee is to the east, and from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. So Jews and Gentiles both, there are probably some Samaritans in the mix here. Doesn't say that, but maybe safe to assume, maybe not. But he's gathered a really great crowd to him. And then in 5:1 it says, seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, like Moses, like Elijah. And he sat down, takes the posture of a teacher, a rabbi, and his disciples came to him. Now this might not seem that important, but I want to hover right here because for the whole history of interpreting Matthew's gospel, this has stood out. It stood out to Origen, it stood out to Augustine, stood out to Bonhoeffer, it stands out. There is a differentiation between the crowds and the disciples. The disciples come out of the crowds. Jesus teaches the disciples, the crowds over here. That's not to say that the people in the crowds aren't paying attention. It isn't to say that they aren't earnest. It isn't even to say that they're not truthful. But it just means that this teaching is directed to Jesus' disciples in a very particular way. He's not yet called the 12 either. So the disciples could be more than just the 12 apostles, right? Even those who will become apostles, Simon, Andrew, James, John, who have been called thus far, they haven't been named as apostles yet. So this is bigger than the 12. These are people who are following Jesus intentionally. They're beginning to give themselves over to him. They're claiming him as a rabbi. When he sits down and takes that posture, these are people who are saying, this is my rabbi. I'm going to heed his teaching. I'm going to follow where he goes. I'm going to learn to model my life on his life. And this moment of differentiation here, right as Jesus begins the fullest teaching that we get from him in all four Gospels, maybe other than the farewell discourse in John, from John 12 to 18. The disciples become visible. This is hugely important. The disciples become visible. Bonhoeffer talks really explicitly and at length about what this means for us. And what this means for us is that any notion of the invisible church. Do you know what I mean when I say the invisible church? Okay, let's talk about that for a second. This is a doctrine that develops alongside the Protestant Reformation, right? It's a way of saying that because God's will in eternity and those that God might elect for salvation, because that's completely inscrutable to us. There's no way that we can know. And we have all of these different kinds of churches now popping up, right? You can't just look to one church and say, that's the church, and all the people who belong to it are Christians. Now you have different kinds of churches, and so this doctrine of the invisible church kind of pops up alongside of it, saying, we don't know who's really a Christian and who's not, because we can't look into people's hearts and judge them for whether they really love Jesus or not. But what happens, and there's some truth to that, right? I don't want to just be like, that's dumb, let's ignore it. But what it does is it begins to obscure. It provides cover for people who want to follow Jesus, but don't want to follow Jesus? Are you with me? Provides cover for saying, like, how can you judge what's inside my heart, even while none of my actions align with following who Jesus calls me to be? Right? And so Bonhoeffer, writing at a really crucial moment in history when the church has been leveraged for all kinds of terrible things in Nazi Germany, even though the Nazis were not Christians, they were willing to use the church just like they were willing to use anything toward their own ends. Bonhoeffer especially says, there is no invisible church. Right? Into that context, he says, we have to be done forever with this. Because it allows some people to claim Jesus or claim to belong to Jesus without ever having to do anything necessary to discipleship. Not that discipleship saves you, but discipleship is the proof in the pudding of being saved. You with me? And so right here at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, right after those first disciples are called, as crowds are beginning to gather to Jesus, and you have this big ambiguous group of people who are there to see and to hear and to experience, the disciples make themselves visible. They become visible. And so a corollary to this is that this teaching is not a private teaching. It's done in public for disciples who have identified themselves in the public square as those belonging to Jesus among a hearing public. So this is another thing that does away forever with notions of the invisible church. You can't say, well, Jesus is Lord, but that's just my opinion. Either he is or he isn't. So this teaching for the disciples becomes personal, but never private. This can't be a part of their life that they're willing to hide away. It can't be relegated. It can't be relegated just to the sphere of opinion. Leslie Newbigin talks about how the gospel is public truth. It's for everybody. It can't be declared only in hidden places. It cannot belong to people only in their private lives. It's a public truth. And so it enjoins a public witness. The people who are going to subscribe that in the era of Netflix, that word has lost some of the purchase I wish it still had. For the people who are going to claim this truth, not as just for them, but as the truth about God, the world, and everything, it engenders in them, it enjoins in them a public witness. My life is going to reflect this, whether I'm out about town or I'm at home with my family. So the disciples, and I mean, if you this morning are here, I would hope that you are at least interested in being a disciple of Jesus. As the church continues to lose its standing in the public square, as it ceases to become a kind of cultural touch point here in American culture as just the mark of being a polite or responsible citizen, my hope is that there's going to be kind of a winnowing, a sifting, right? These are phrases that Jesus uses, right? John the Baptist says he's got his winnowing fork in his hand and he's going to separate the wheat from the chaff. And we always thought, man, he's going to do that out in the world, but man, he's doing that right in here. Jesus says to Peter, Peter, Satan wants to sift you like wheat, like flour. And Jesus does not tell Peter, I'm going to protect you from that. Don't worry. What he promises Peter is, I'm going to sustain you through that. And I don't want it to just be the confidence that I have about the way that I see things. I will consider my ministry to have been a failure. I will consider the work that I've done in this role, in this place, to have been done in vain. If the people who belong to this church do not want to be disciples in public, if they are not willing to differentiate themselves from the crowd, if they are unwilling to give their lives over as a public witness to the public truth that Jesus is Lord, and that's not just our opinion. No pressure. But what we hear in Jesus as the disciples differentiate themselves from the crowd is Jesus offers the interpretation of his life in the Sermon on the Mount. When he speaks these Beatitudes, when he teaches these teachings, he's saying everything that's going to follow from this point on, every teaching, every healing, every parable, the walk to Jerusalem, the ascent to the cross, everything that happens in my life, this is the interpretive key. Or this is this set of teachings. These sayings are the interpretation of Jesus' life. And at the same time, his life is necessary to interpret the sermon. The temptation to make the Sermon on the Mount a private ethic for Christians is so vast through the history of the church wrestling with these teachings. We will not understand this teaching without the life, the death, the resurrection, and the ascension of Jesus to help us understand what it means. Because these cannot only be a restatement of the law of Moses ramped up in order to make us feel guilty so that we come to rely on the grace of Jesus. Do they do that? Sure. But if that's all they are, we're not in any other kind of boat. If that's all they are, we didn't need this manifestation. We didn't need to see this glory. Nor are they only what life will look like in the age to come, because what we know about Jesus and his life is that he is the embodiment of God's age to come here in the middle of this time. The new age is made possible in time. The new age is not just the last thing on the line, the timeline. It's not just the last episode that happens at the end of all things. It's beyond the line. It takes the line, turns it inside out and upside down and says, this is what God is doing to all things. So this has to become for us the way that we understand Jesus' life and the way that our lives are joined to his, so that we are not left without hope in this world. And before Jesus gets into any of the other stuff, especially the hard stuff, like, the whole thing about, like, don't get angry with your neighbor because if you do, you might as well just be murdering them. Or don't lust after other people because if you do, you might as well just be committing adultery with that person. Or don't swear oaths, or if somebody hits you, don't hit them back. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Before Jesus gets into any of that stuff, he starts with a series of blessings. Because that's what the Beatitudes are. They're blessings. Now, maybe that was obvious to you because Jesus says, blessed are. Blessed are, blessed are. One way to think about this, though, the Latin word beatitude, it's also connected to this idea that when we die and we go to be with Jesus, but even more so when the line is the timeline that everything exists on, caught in time, when that's undone as kind of what God is planning on doing in order, when he is all in all, right? When he fills all things. When he is all and is in all, as Paul says across his letters. Then our beholding of God face to face in Jesus, that's called the beatific vision, right? And that's, for a long time, that's kind of been what theologians say, like, this is the goal of everything. The goal of everything is, Paul says it in 1 Corinthians 13, right now I see through a mirror darkly, right? I see in a glass darkly, but then I shall see face to face, and I shall be fully known even as I am fully known. So to understand that is where all of this, that this is where God is taking us, can help us understand the use of the same word, the beatific vision, as kind of what God is aiming all of this at, bringing that back and reading that into the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. It helps us to know that what God wants to do now, what God is showing us now, is that his goal for everything, his end, his vision, the way that Archbishop Desmond Tutu used to talk about it was, this is God's dream. That it's not, that yes, it only gets completed when everything gets turned upside down and inside out, but we begin tasting that, seeing that, touching that now. In Jesus. Through the most unlikely ways imaginable. Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. Another way of translating that word that we translate blessed is fortunate or lucky. Think about that. How many times have you driven by somebody on the side of the street who you could easily identify as someone who is, in Luke's gospel, Luke's version of this, he doesn't say poor in spirit, he just says poor. And there is a connection between material poverty and poverty of spirit, and we don't always know, it's like chicken and egg, right? Which one comes first, and is it chosen poverty or not chosen poverty? But, or when you're with someone who's mourning, how many times have you sat across from somebody who's mourning and thought to yourself, man, they're so lucky? You're trying to fix it. If you're anything like me, you're trying to fix it. Let me give a word of hope. Let me inject a little bit of levity. Let me try to bring this person back into the land of the living as they mourn, which is stupid, not the right way to go. But it is my natural reaction. Maybe that's an indication that I need a supernatural reaction. Or happy. You can translate this word happy. Happy are those who mourn. Happy are the meek. Happy are those who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness or otherwise. What Jesus is saying is that there's some sort of indication that the estate of these people now reveals something to us about God's good intentions for everything. Another way of maybe thinking about this is to say, the poor in spirit, they understand the good life. Like in some way that goes beyond what we think we know about the good life. The meek, they understand something about the good life in a way that the powerful never will in this life. Think about this for just a second. Think about this in the context of those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. I think there's some, I don't want this to turn into summer camp or a youth group, but those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, those whose convictions run so deep, those who are so given over to a love that is beyond anything that we can know, that they are willing to suffer for it. They understand something about the good life that those of us who are not persecuted don't have access to. Or at least not yet. Peacemakers, that's the one that always gets to me. I think last year when this text comes up every year at some point in the lectionary. I think last year I kind of talked about a pastor in Arizona who made some really dumb statements about the differences between peacemakers and peacekeepers, and that we should seek to be peacekeepers, and that legitimates our use of violence. You couldn't be farther from Jesus. Peacemakers are those who put their bodies on the line to interrupt violence. By refusing to use, by doing exactly what Paul says to the Romans in the heart of the empire they cannot do. Do not return violence for violence, Paul says. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord, not yours. How can this be the good life? This can only be the good life if Christ is the key. If we understand that Christ is the peacemaker who has put his body on the line to interrupt violence for our sake so that we no longer suffer it. If this is true, and I'm betting the house on it. A colleague of mine just announced that he's stepping away from a ministry that he's been leading for 12 years, and that he's looking for he's open to roles in ministry, but he's also looking outside of ministry. And I think this guy, I think he's a good minister. I really do. Despite differences I've had with him in the past, I do think he's a good minister. I think he's done a faithful job. But I think what he sees, I know there's things going on inside of him. He's written about it publicly. He got published in Christianity Today a couple years ago about how he's been wrestling with this for years. But I think there's another thing going on, which is to say, we see, guys, ministers, men and women in my generation, they see the writing on the wall. For every 100 baby boomers that there are who are evangelical Christians, there are only 80 Gen X and millennials together. This isn't people walking away from the faith. This is the largest generation in the history of America just dying. Sorry for those of you who are boomers. I'm not trying to be mean or rude. This is not an okay boomer moment. This is biology, right? My parents are boomers. I love them. I'm not wishing them gone, But if you look at, and there are other church contexts, liberal and conservative, The Episcopal Church is one church. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is another church. In both of these churches, there's only 60 combined Gen X and millennials for every 100 baby boomers. This is a demographic cliff that's just coming. And we don't, what is the church going to look like on the other side of that? Just different, smaller. Not because of unfaithfulness, not because of apostasy, not because of anything other than numbers. When I think about for me, the good life, what does it mean for me as a pastor? Looking over the edge of this cliff. Will I be able to earn an income as the church just gets smaller? And this is not an invitation. Can we get the trays going one more time? Can we pass the trays again? Can we lock the doors until we get to our goal? That's not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is how can anyone look at this and say this is the good life if these are some of the realities that we're looking at? All the way from Christians being persecuted in some of the most oppressive societies on earth, in China, Iran, Nigeria, some parts of Mexico even, the most Catholic nation on earth. Think about that. I think if this is true, then what God is showing us is that God is not raising up an army. God doesn't need an army here on earth. He commands the heavenly host with Michael at the fore. Archangel Michael? Okay, good. All right. What God is raising up is a community of holy fools. In 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about the paradox of the cross. People want wisdom, people want signs, and what God offers up is a torture device? The cross becomes a shorthand, right? We talk about the cross, and I think sometimes because Jesus dies on the cross, that's the only part of what Jesus does and who Jesus is that we think about when we think about it. But it's supposed to be a symbol that catches everything, not just his atoning death. It catches everything. It catches his life, his teachings, his death, his resurrection, his ascension, his glorified state at the right hand of the Father. When we look at the cross, we're supposed to see everything. Everything. When we look at the cross, we can see the Beatitudes. We can see that if this is the way that God is saving the world, then of course those who hunger and thirst for righteousness are blessed. Of course the pure in heart are blessed. Of course the poor in spirit are blessed. Because what God has done is he's taken the tree of death, cursed is everyone who's hung on a tree, and he's transformed it into the tree of life. So that the wisdom of the wise and the discerning of the discernment of the discerning and the power of the powerful, it's all just turned into nothing. And out of nothing, God brings life. Out of a place that could only promise death. And death is the absence of life. It's its own kind of weird nothing. Right? It's going to be undone. Micah, the prophet, speaks a similar word. That all of these things that we think add up to our way of relating to God. And I don't want to get into anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic interpretations of the Old Testament. That's nonsense. God's saying that to the Jews, don't bring me fattened offerings. Don't let the rivers of oil flow. Do justice. Love mercy. Walk humbly with me. This is what God requires. In the face of overwhelming opposition, in a world so touched by sin and marked by death, we cannot give ourselves over to those things that are opposed to God and opposed by God. The Beatitudes are, interestingly enough, not requirements, but they are realities. If you look around those who are gathered to Jesus, those who have made themselves visible, those who have differentiated themselves from the crowd and have said, I'm going to pattern my life on this person's life, God's person's life, God in person's life, then I'm going to look around and I'm going to see those who are poor in spirit. I'm going to see those who mourn. I'm going to see the meek. I may even find myself to be someone to be merciful. I may be shocked to discover that I'm pure in heart. This is who Jesus gathers. It's an invitation into the heart of God. And so what does that mean for us? There's a long tradition of talking about happiness and holiness, both as the same thing or as necessary for each other. A Christian cannot be happy unless they are holy. A Christian cannot be holy unless they're happy. And this is not a false kind of cheerfulness, right? This is not a veneer of happiness. This is the same kind of happiness that Jesus pronounces. Happy are the poor in spirit, happy are those who mourn, happy are the meek. I think what this means for us, my friends, is that this is going to be like, this is such a disappointing end to this sermon, maybe. Giant letdown, right? God's not raising us up as an army. God's not sending us out to conquer. God is calling you to be a holy, happy fool. Someone who does the opposite of what the world would advise or recommend. Someone who is willing to pattern their life on Jesus and who is enabled to do it by God's grace. Someone who's able to look to the cross and understand that it's not just that God has done something for me, but that God has come to be with me. Even to give me himself. So that in whatever time I find myself to be, God's new age might start springing up out of the cracks in the ground in that place. It's hard, this is the last thing I'm going to say. Man, I loved being a youth pastor. Libby was in my youth group. Poor thing. She's recovered, it seems. But the thing about youth group is, you can do a lot of, go and do this now, or you ought to do this. So there's a lot of thus saith the Lord, I guess. And that's a way easier way to preach. I think the thing that I've learned is hardest about preaching in these days is that some days all you can do is stand up and say what's true. And I feel like that's just like Jesus isn't commanding us to be poor in spirit. Like Jesus doesn't stand up and say, go be poor in spirit. Go figure out how to, go mourn somewhere and see if you can draw some attention to yourself. Go be a peacemaker. That's not what the Beatitudes are. The Beatitudes are a declaration of reality. Jesus is these things, and therefore we should not be surprised to find people who are like that in his company. I guess if there are two takeaways, this is what they would be. First, if anyone is claiming Jesus for their own purposes or agenda, and their life doesn't look like his life as it's revealed in the Beatitudes, there are a lot of questions to ask. A lot. The second thing that I would say is this. The last thing that you need to do is to walk away from this church service and go try to become these things. Instead, I would invite you into moments of quiet and stillness like Steve did for us this morning. And look with holy curiosity at how God maybe has already made you some of these things. And then just be that as a public witness to the public truth that Jesus is Lord. And that's not just my opinion, man. Let's pray.